This is Desaliny, and welcome to episode 23 of 90s Overlooked Underheard. So yes, this series has taken a very short break, but we are back, and in this episode we are in 1996. Today we're going to talk about lo-fi. Yeah, so lo-fi is a pretty loose, kind of ill-defined term, I guess. It has been around for years. I mean, Paul McCartney's 1970 debut solo album was described as lo-fi just because of its kind of the nature of its recording. I guess that's all you would say about lo-fi, you know, without wanting to waste too much time on it, is that it's basically music that's recorded quickly or cheaply outside of a studio, usually somewhere like a bedroom or at home, and usually capturing a less kind of polished sound, a rougher or more immediate take on the songs that are being recorded. But in our timeline, in the 90s, lo-fi started to kind of get codified as a thing, a sound, whether that happened to be recorded in a bedroom or in a studio. I think this is very much like the way that subsequently, you know, indie has become defined as a sound. Indie used to mean something that was recorded on an independent record label, but now we've kind of wrapped up what our thoughts are about that and put it into a kind of a sound or a genre. So yeah, towards the end of the 80s, going into the 90s, I think lo-fi kind of came to be associated with certain types of act, certain bands. So a lot of the kind of early post-punk, maybe The Fall, circa their kind of rough trade releases. Certainly the music that was coming out of New Zealand on the Flying Nun label, bands like The Clean, that would be considered lo-fi. And I think you could certainly consider a lot of the kind of the C86 era bands as being, you know, that shambly, jangly, kind of lo-fi sound. They would probably be considered lo-fi too. Into the 90s, and I think this kind of, the idea of lo-fi became much more solidified around a group of bands like Pavement, Sebadoh, possibly some of Beck's earliest material. It also became associated with the two bands that I am going to talk about today. So the first of today's bands, the first of today's albums, is Ain't My Lookout by the Grifters, released on the 13th of February 1996. So the Grifters formed kind of around about the tail end of the 1980s, going into the very early 1990s. In fact, 1990 was the year that they became the Grifters. They formed in Memphis, Tennessee. The core of the band was initially Scott Taylor on guitar and vocals, Trip Lampkins on bass, and Dave Schaus, who was initially the drummer, but being a singer-songwriter in his own right, he gradually moved to the kind of vocals and guitars himself. And the drum spot was finally kind of filled by Stan Gallimore. So in the early part of the 90s, yes, there was a run of albums that the Grifters released, starting with So Happy Together, One Sock Missing, and then Crappin' You Negative in 1994. These three albums came out to increasing levels of public attention and of critical acclaim. This episode's album, Ain't My Lookout, was the band's fourth album and its first on Sub Pop Records. Just out of interest, in kind of subsequent years, the band did kind of, following their initial kind of dissolution, they did reform for some kind of tours and dates in around about the 2010s sometime. And interviews from the band at the time suggest that Ain't My Lookout is, in fact, their favourite of the albums that they recorded as a band together. I think the previous album, Crappin' You Negative, is kind of still considered to be kind of the fans' favourite. And I think that's probably because it does encapsulate more of that explicitly lo-fi sound of the band's earlier period. But despite being a kind of a cleaner, kind of more well-produced effort, Ain't My Lookout was actually recorded at the same place that they'd recorded their previous albums, which was Easley Recording in Memphis. The band was kind of quite keen to just give this kind of record a bit more of a layer of polish, so they did do some additional recording at what was then the new Sun Studios that had been recently built in Memphis. The band are pretty insistent that even though they may have been kind of trying to record a little cleaner and a little kind of more polished sounds, they were basically recording in exactly the same way. They were writing in exactly the same way as all their previous albums. They like keeping it kind of loose and collaborative. They like to kind of just come up with ideas on the spur of the moment, try things out, push the dials a little. And there's still a lot of that on Ain't My Lookout. I think if you can pinpoint one area where they possibly did kind of hold back a little on this album. It's in the kind of the extreme kind of EQing that they would use. Anyone who's listened to any of the first 3 albums would hear these kind of radically different kind of sounds being kind of introduced in the space of the same song. This is a much more kind of coherent sound. And I think that's the main thing that contributes to this kind of slight kind of sheen, this kind of layer of polish that the record has. So the sound of the Grifters. Yeah, you always hear kind of the words bluesy or stonesy along with the obvious lo-fi. Yeah, I get that. It's kind of pretty riff-heavy, bluesy kind of guitar sounds that they use. But I think that does neglect this kind of lo-fi element to their sound, which was the kind of the freer, kind of more psychedelic sounding elements that they brought to their music. I'd be much more inclined to think of someone like The Pretty Things. Their SF Sorrow album is kind of a classic of that kind of, blues R&B psychedelic kind of crossover. It was a very heavy influence on The Who's Tommy. Listen to a song from that album like Barren Saturday. And yeah, it's got a very kind of lo-fi Grifters kind of sound. These kind of veering between bluesy elements and these kind of much more kind of shrill, challenging, psychedelic sounds. Yeah, and while I'm delving into the past, I mean, Bowie was acknowledged as a huge fan of The Pretty Things music. He covered 2 of their songs on his Pinups album, I believe. And in the Grifters, in some of the vocals, I do hear a little Bowie as well. It's something in the kind of the cadence and the rhythm and the phrasing of the vocals. That slightly kind of hiccuping rhythm that gets resolved kind of unexpectedly into this kind of burst of harmony. Yeah, very kind of playful vocal style. Anyway, on to some key songs from the album. The opening track, Covered with Flies. This is one of my favourite album openers from any album of the 1990s. It's got this very weird kind of vocal line which seems to kind of cut across the main melody. Very weird, cut up kind of guitar bursts, this huge kind of booming bass line that just butts in every now and then. It's kind of a classic Grifters sound, very playful. You hear that playfulness again as well on Mysterious Friends. This one also sung by Dave Schaus, by the way. It has this kind of meandering, kind of semi-resolved melody which kind of loops around with these weird little vocal bop sounds dropped in, almost like percussion. But yeah, it has this kind of woozy, kind of staggering feel with these lovely kind of little reverbed, tremoloed guitar textures dropping in and out. Yeah, but this is a kind of a moody, kind of slightly more menacing, but really cool track. Yeah, moving on to Boho Alt. This one's sung by Scott Taylor. Yeah, he sings, "Oh, to be the state of the art of Boho Alt." It's kind of almost this kind of boozy barroom lament, which kind of explodes into this kind of skyscraping, kind of psychedelic monster a few minutes in. Yeah, this one's really wonderful stuff. It shares, I think, a little DNA with another kind of lo-fi act of the 90s. That would be the Archers of Loaf. They were very keen on kind of, ribbing kind of the scenesters and the tastemakers of the day with their lyrics. I'm back with another number sung by Dave Schaus, Last Man Alive. This was the single from the album. And yeah, it's a surprisingly classic, kind of snappy, sub 3-minute single. Yeah, a very easily digestible kind of piece of, alternative pop. But even then, within that 3 minutes, it's still remarkably skewed. It feels like a bunch of different things just all crunched together, which somehow the Grifters make work time and time again. And speaking of like crunching ideas together and this kind of studio experimentation, which they love to do, the track My Apology. This one really kind of encapsulates the whole feel of the album, I think. There's just that idea that you capture an accident and then, you double down on it. You make it the main feature, the main hook of the song. You get these kind of weird, test vocals, if you like, just dropping in and out. The band laughing, kind of making things up on the spot. And they kind of build the song around it using these kind of synth strings and slide guitar interludes. Yeah, they throw the kitchen sink at this one and it just works. It's just really fun. Yeah, I think with a little distance from the 90s now, I think we can appreciate this album a bit more. I would think that fans of the band would now listen to it and be able to kind of take in the songs for what they were. So moving on to today's second album, and we have Under the Bushes, Under the Stars by Guided by Voices, released on the 26th of March, 1996. Yeah, I think possibly along with Pavement, Guided by Voices are the quintessential lo-fi act to emerge from the 1990s. So Guided by Voices were straight out of Dayton, Ohio, and formed in around about 1983 around the core of singer, songwriter, guitarist Robert Pollard. I think alongside maybe Sebadoh, I think GBV are probably the most genuinely lo-fi of the lo-fi acts. Most of their early releases were recorded on the most primitive of equipment. We're talking cassette 4 tracks, boom boxes, rehearsal recordings, very little in the way of kind of conscious production technique, certainly on the early material. I think the lo-fi aspect of Guided by Voices music came about almost as a necessity due to Robert Pollard's just legendary prolificness. At the last count, there are something like 3,000 songs registered to Bob Pollard on the BMI database. Yeah, he seems to shed songs like some people shed dandruff. Yeah, a normal year for Bob Pollard would probably consist of at least a couple of Guided by Voices albums and probably, a couple of solo releases as well. In fact, if you look at the band in their latest incarnation, look at their release schedule. From 2019 onwards, they've been releasing either 2 or 3 albums every year. It's pretty insane. But anyway, back to the 90s, and this is the decade when, GBV got serious. Pollard quit his teaching job to concentrate on Guided by Voices full time. In fact, financial pressures really got to him following the recording and release of their Propeller LP. So he did actually fold the band and go back to full-time teaching. But ironically enough, that was the album that was finally noticed, finally picked up. And the band reconvened almost immediately, a year later in 1993, to record a follow-up. Yeah, that follow-up album was called Vampire on Titus. And I think around about this time, you see the kind of the classic, what you would consider the classic lineup of GBV of this period start to form. That was Bob on guitar and vocals, Jim Pollard, Bob's brother, on bass, Mitch Mitchell on additional guitar, and Tobin Sprout also on guitar and vocals. There were several drummers for them during this period as well. Kevin Fennell and Don Thrasher are the two that stand out most. Yeah, Tobin Sprout on guitar and vocals was a very capable singer-songwriter in his own right. Yeah, Tobin did contribute songs to many GBV albums and many solo recordings of his own. But his output just had no chance of keeping up with Pollard. So inevitably you end up getting maybe 1 or 2 Tobin Sprout songs on most kind of GBV albums of this period, the rest all being Pollard compositions. So yeah, following this period of kind of dissolution and reformation and finally getting some traction in the wider media, we get what I call the trilogy. So yeah, there's a run of albums from 1994 to 1996, which just catapulted Guided by Voices into a much bigger sphere. They gained a much wider audience. So B1000 in 1994, Alien Lanes in 1995, and today's album, Under the Bushes, Under the Stars, in 1996. You regularly see B1000 cropping up in lists of best albums of the 90s. It was in the most recent Pitchfork list of best albums of the 90s. Yeah, I happen to think Alien Lanes is just as good. That's just me. So Under the Bushes finally saw the band, take a bit of a gamble on pushing for a bigger production. They were recording on 24 tracks for this album for the first time. But the recording of Under Bushes is quite a fragmented affair. There was several producers involved, some quite big names in here as well. Kim Deal, Steve Albini, and you also got Dave McCain and Doug Easley. And despite the kind of the piecemeal nature of the recording, everything did come together. In fact, as ever, GBV kind of over-recorded, resulting in enough tracks for an album and, a bonus EP. Yeah, Matador was set on just releasing the album, but they did relent at the last minute. The stuff that was kind of earmarked for this bonus kind of EP was just too good, and they, in fact, issued the album with the EP. So yeah, the Guided by Voices sound, yeah, this is all Bob Pollard's show. It's this mix of kind of classic sounding 60s psych prog rock mixed with post-punk sounds. Yeah, you hear heavy kind of echoes of The Who in a lot of Pollard's writing, and he's got a real kind of McCartney-like ear for vocal melodies. Yeah, you pick up on a slightly folky element as well to some of the writing in both a kind of a prog rock sense and also in some of the post-punk kind of bands that they would have been listening to at the time as well. So you do get kind of some of that REM kind of murky jangle, the early REM sound. There's also a real dash of kind of power pop as well in there, you know, stuff like Cheap Trick. Yeah, this is kind of supremely catchy and classic sounding. I can't think of a better way of describing it than classic sounding. On hearing Guided by Voices songs for the first time, you will probably think this must be a cover. This sounds like something from the 60s. Yeah, they really bottle that sound of kind of, you know, like 60s British invasion pop, but in a kind of scrappier, more post-punk kind of container. Just to mention here for Tobin Sprout as well, his contributions are consistently less kind of flashy than Pollard's, but he does have a really good ear for these kind of jangly melodies. It provides a really nice counterpoint sometimes to Pollard's very, very focused, very identifiable sound. So yeah, I would agree that Under the Bushes isn't as consistently kind of jam-packed, as killer sounding as B1000 or Alien Lanes. But I think as a part of this kind of loose trilogy of albums, it is very much overlooked. And that's why I'm including it in this list. So yeah, some key tracks, and apologies straight up that most of these will be Bob Pollard's. I will give the briefest of shout outs here to Tobin Sprout's track, It's Like Soul Man. I think it's one of his very best. And the fact that it's kind of tucked away on the bonus EP for this album is what tells you everything you need to know about GBV. So yeah, the album opener is Man Called Aerodynamics, this kind of manic, kind of crushing opener. Pollard kind of stretches his vocal melody over this kind of really clattering, aggressive backing. Very hooky, very in your face. It's a really good opener. You get Cut Out Witch. This is classic Bob Pollard. He totally does the Townsend thing in this one. That kind of I Can See for Miles trick where you open with just the guitar and the vox and then the band kind of slams in. Stupendous songwriting, really irresistible stuff. Yeah, the single from the album was the official Iron Man rally song. This is one that channels those kind of heavy, slightly murky, jangly REM vibes. I get kind of a strong feeling of like Fables period REM from this song. But yeah, it's a much more anthemic sound than REM ever managed at that period in their career. Yeah, Underwater Explosions. Again, just this kind of magic vocal melody over what is a fairly simple backing. But it's just given this huge, great kind of power pop injection, 60s kind of psychedelic vibes. Yeah, I get kind of a feel of kind of Soft Boys, Robin Hitchcock kind of era, that kind of power pop here. And yeah, these songs, they're all over so quickly, they come thick and fast. You get Don't Stop Now. This massive kind of Beatlesy melody grafted onto a kind of this beefy, kind of spiraling, spinning, jangling guitar riff. Huge guitar sound. And the song has this massive kind of melancholic feel, this huge punch in the gut. For me, this is one of Guided by Voices' best ever songs. And yeah, that bonus EP, it wasn't just great Tobin Sprout tracks being kind of put there. You get Drag Days. This is a personal favourite of mine. And again, it's got kind of those power pop kind of vibes. I get a real strong feeling of like something like the Flaming Groovies on this one. It's got a slightly weary, kind of resigned feel. But this amazing lift comes at the end with Pollard's vocal in the very closing sections. Yeah, this one's just a killer song. So there you go. Yeah, lo-fi. And perversely, kind of two bands and two albums by those bands who were kind of pushing the limits of what lo-fi was at that time. This is bands trying to kind of just break out of that kind of box. Yeah, please like and or subscribe below if you feel suitably moved to do so. In the meantime, take care. I'll see you again. Bye for now.